what I have decided to talk about this afternoon, as this is a conference about culture, is to talk about culture and its interrelationship with politics. And I'm going to do this as best I can by a comparison between some trends in this respect in England and France. And the reason why I'm going to do that is that, first of all, the talk confined to an approximately 30-minute slot has to have some bounds, and secondly, I know rather more about French culture than I do about German or Italian, so it's the obvious one to use as a comparator. Jean-Paul Sartre might sound a strange choice to take in a conference of rightists, though in truth he is in many ways a far more troublesome figure for the left. This is the man who in 1940 not only accommodated himself after the French surrender to the new order of things, which many did and might be thought all too human if not very heroic, but seems actually tremendously to have enjoyed life in Paris during that period. He delivered himself with the immortal words, "We were never so free as under the occupation," which is not something that his admirers were fond of quoting. But I'm not here to discuss Sartre's life generally or his own morally compromised and complex political positions, but rather one of his ideas, which he called in French engagement, and is probably best translated into English as commitment. I can't think of another English word that translates the idea better. And this is essentially one of the two views that can be taken about the interrelationship between politics and culture. For some, the two have always been separated by a chasm. For some, the view has always been that politics is by definition low politics and culture is by definition high culture. A prominent exponent of this view in 19th century French letters was Théophile Gautier, best known for his commitment to what he called l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake. And he expressed, it was in, I think, the preface to Mademoiselle de Maupin, the view which I shall translate into English as, "Nothing is really beautiful except that which is useless. That which is useful can only be ugly." Now, much though I admire Gautier in many ways, I cannot agree with those sentiments, although it's important to place them in a particular context. He was reacting against the Romantic movement, which was perhaps the first major movement in literature to fuse politics with culture. Goethe did this undoubtedly. By the end of the 18th century, you see the close fusion between literary romanticism and the nationalist movement that was then beginning to burgeon in Europe and was to become the dominant ideology of Europe in the 19th century. I have to say, the older I have got and the more I have studied European history, the less I like nationalism and the less I think of it. But that was not the mood of that time, and the reasons why I'll touch upon perhaps very briefly when I mention one of the most important figures in the idea of the engaged writer in French culture, the famous nationalist writer Maurice Barrès, who certainly shows what happens when you let nationalism get hold of your mind to such an extent that it begins to affect your perception of reality, which in his case it did in very disturbing ways. We'll come on to the not very nice title that he was given in the course of the First World War as an interesting example. But Victor Hugo, who was one of the most significant French Romantic writers, undoubtedly combined a strong political commitment, in his case of a distinctly leftist nature, with his literary oeuvre. He wouldn't have pleased those speakers today who see a strong link between traditionalism, nationalism and libertarianism. I was like the words of the hero of Les Miserables, Enjolras, citoyen, ta mère, c'est la République, citizen, the state is your mother, not a sentence which, as I say, all would necessarily approve of. Though on the other hand, I am more reluctant to condemn it. I don't actually see so close a connection between the cult of individual liberty and nationalist and traditionalist ideas as some do. On the contrary, the two have largely been in opposition to one another, in my view, for a very long period of time. The cult of individual liberty emerged even, well, I was going to say with the English, but more with the Scottish Enlightenment in the later part of the 18th century, and is in many ways antithetical to the traditional social order of Europe. Ezra Pound, at the end of the 38th canto, excoriates the entire business class, in many ways the heroes of the Adam Smith Institute. The famous words, they put their interests above those of the nation, which are meant as a reproach, but in the eyes of that class are taken as a natural right and the ordinary order of things. But while, as I say, there has been considerable opposition in European thought to the idea that there is or can be a link between the arts and politics, and as I say, this was quite prominent in the thought of the so-called Parnassian school of 19th century France. It has not been so through much of human history. It's odd, even with the Parnassians. They look back to classical models. They dislike the Romantics, and very much in the French tradition, which looks back to classical antiquity. And they sought to return to older models. They seem to have glossed over the nature of state patronage of the arts in the ancient world quite remarkably. Virgil, for example, could be described by some as the court sycophant of Augustus, which would be rather unkind, but the emperor had him round to do readings of his own poetry to the imperial family. Horace, much the same, and long before that, this had been well established in the ancient world. The Spartans, for all their supposed frugality, paid Simonides, who was not a Spartan, he came from the island of Chios, a huge sum of money to compose the famous epigram upon the Spartan death at Thermopylae. They knew very well the link between culture, the state, tradition, nationalism, and patriotism. Now, that link exists in the 20th century, and we'll see it in both in England and in France. But according to the post-1945 rewriting of European history, you would think that only the left had had a significant impact upon and engagement in the literary and artistic worlds. This is quite untrue. Not only is it untrue on the continent, it is also untrue in England. And one of the remarkable things about English intellectual life in the 20th century is how much kind of iron curtain comes down. And not the one about which Winston Churchill was talking, although he was right, I think, when he mentioned that as a political idea in Europe, but a cultural iron curtain that came down at around the same time, when everyone who didn't conform to a prevailing liberal left orthodoxy was more or less written out of history. Or if they were too important to be written out of history, they were rewritten in positively Orwellian fashion so as to exclude those parts of their work which were deeply politically incorrect. A very extreme example of that, which I'll come, was Henry Williamson. But let me take things slightly more in order. I don't think that what happened in post-1945 order, the, as I say, disappearance down Orwellian memory holes of major literary and artistic figures who did not conform to the ideas which have held sway for at least 2 or 3 generations, perhaps longer. But that is pure chance. We're indebted to the Italian deviant Marxist Gramsci for the idea of hegemony. Now, Gramsci was a very, very interesting man. He was a hideously ugly, misshapen dwarf with an enormous hatred of anybody who was healthier or better looking or taller than himself, which as he was about 4'8", had yellow skin, and was perhaps the ugliest man to have lived in the 20th century, meant most of the rest of the world. Not surprising, therefore, that he became a Marxist. It was this as good as his betters, which was about 99.99 recurring percent of the human race. But despite these manifest defects, I do actually feel sorry in more ways than one that he came to a rather unhappy end in one of Benito Mussolini's insalubrious jails. Admittedly, one of the reasons I feel sorry for him is perhaps slightly unkind reason. Those of his comrades who escaped the Soviet Union generally died in far worse circumstances than the ones who had remained in Italy, and it might have been good for him to experience the full rigours of the proletariat revolution and the reordering of society by Comrade Joseph Vissarionovich. But nevertheless, despite these aspects of his political views and indeed his general personal appearance and so on that were distasteful to anyone of refined sensibilities, or indeed any sensibilities at all, he actually had some very, very interesting ideas. And he had some ideas. I make no claim to originality in this respect. A much greater thinker than I, Alain de Benoit, who drew these conclusions 40 years ago and more, that we can learn much from Gramsci. Gramsci understood the importance of the cultural struggle, not really the intellectual struggle, but the cultural struggle as part of the political process. In this respect, he deviated from Marx's orthodoxy, which saw society as determined, or political developments in society as determined entirely by the clash of competing economic class interests. He did not entirely accept that. And indeed, he coined the famous phrase, the long march through the institutions, the idea that the left would come to power by winning over an elite, not so much a social elite as an intellectual elite, that would in its turn remake society in its own shape. This, I think, was a brilliant insight and a brilliant idea, and one from which we have been far, far too slow to learn. And it is an idea which the left has been advancing in England possibly longer than in any other country. Already before the First World War, the origins or beginnings of this process can be seen. By the interwar years, it had become very difficult for anyone who moved in artistic and literary circles not to be of the left, although, as we shall see, although it was difficult, there were a number of outstanding figures who did. It is surprisingly easy to impose a hegemony of ideas upon the world of culture and the arts. People in those worlds like to think of themselves as non-conformist, independent thinkers and so on. It is actually largely rubbish. It illustrates me very well. 4 years ago, I went to see a fascinating exhibition on an enormous and lavish scale at the Getty Center just outside Los Angeles, which some of you may have visited. It was a retrospective upon the French artist Jean-Léon Gérôme, a man with no particular political opinions. He'd been one of the salon painters at the time when the Impressionists were just coming into vogue. The remarkable thing about Gérôme, who's nowadays remembered only mainly for the famous painting Pollice Verso, when the emperor gives the thumbs down to the defeated gladiator, was the scope and impressive nature of his work, not only as an artist but as a sculptor. And the collection of his paintings there was truly enormous, and they were all of the most impressive nature. Now, what was interesting was to read what the cataloguist said, bearing in mind that this is what you might call the acme of the American academic artistic establishment. It is apparent, writes the cataloguist, that Gérôme was a far more talented and technically gifted artist than almost any of the Impressionists, But his work has been swept into the memory hole because the Impressionists became fashionable, and they became fashionable to deride the salon painters without any attempt to compare the merits of the two schools' technical achievements. And this, as I say, can happen in the visual arts, where you would think it was particularly difficult to impose an ideology, or much more difficult than in literature. Nor does this only happen to those who might be called conservative, traditionalist, or classicist writers. Some of you may remember the remarkable exhibition, and I'm afraid it deeply depressed me when I found out which year it had happened, because it reminds me how old I'm getting. So that the Hayward Gallery in 1995, almost 20 years ago, heaven help me, Art and Power, Europe Under the Dictators. What is interesting about this exhibition was not only that it showed, which isn't surprising, that those artists who enjoyed the patronage of the state in Germany between 1933 and 1945 paid the price of that after 1945 by being cast into obscurity and excluded from the canon. It's also remarkable how much the socialist realist school, which enjoyed Stalin's patronage, has similarly been demoted and cast into a large measure of obscurity. Mainly because Stalin was, in truth, deeply conservative in his literary, artistic, and musical tastes, as well as in his opinions of a great many other matters. I can't imagine gay marriage being high on the agenda of the Soviet Union under Stalin. Nor indeed was he going to be appreciative of somebody who went and sort of sprayed brown paint over a canvas and called this a major contribution to the artistic corpus. Lenin, before him, incidentally, had been surprisingly conservative in his views on art and literature. But the post-war consensus has excluded not only those who, as I say, had gone rather beyond flirting with the far right, it's excluded those who were once mainstream Marxists, because the ideas of the Soviet Union itself are now seen as too conservative and too traditional in many ways for a post-war destructive liberal order. Now, I'm going to be careful not to overrun my speaking time. I've been told, I think, that I have 10 minutes. So what I'm going to do is to look very briefly at some of the figures in British or English artistic and literary life who can be taken to be of the first rank, and yet whose ideas were very, very antithetical to those which prevail in the modern world. One example who is surprisingly little remembered is Wyndham Lewis. Now, he is remarkable because he achieved the first rank both as a painter and as an author, a true Renaissance man. There are very, very few people who excel nowadays in more than one area of human endeavour, but he was one. The most remarkable portrait painter of the 20th century, also a great writer. He was Canadian by birth, although largely educated in Paris, and in the later years, the 1930 years of the 20th century. He served in the First World War with considerable courage in an artillery regiment. He was an artillery spotter, which was one of the most dangerous jobs you could have. You had the doubtful pleasure of crawling forward into no man's land to get a nice good view of the German trenches so you could call down artillery fire on them. Of course, the Germans knew that people were going to bring down death and destruction upon their heads with the artillery spotters. So the first target of any German sniper, artilleryman, machine gunner, or whatever was the artillery spotter, and your life expectancy was not so good. Somewhat surprisingly, he survived, which was a very good thing. He then became a very major figure in the London art and literary world of interwar years. He was perhaps the founder and certainly the most brilliant exponent of the Vorticist school of painting, which combined modernist and traditionalist elements in the most interesting way. And he was also a significant writer. His major works included a marvellous collection called The Apes of God, which mocks the left-leaning literary milieu of interwar London, where he already wrote by the 1930s that there was a left-wing orthodoxy which it was dangerous to defy. He did defy them in the most strongest way possible, particularly taking issue with them over the Spanish Civil War, where not only did he write a long novel, marvellously named Revenge for Love, which does pours pretty much vitriol not only upon the Spanish communists, but more upon their intellectual fellow travellers in the Anglo-Saxon world. But he distinguished himself by painting a painting which is not quite so well known as Pablo Picasso's Guernica, although it's a much better painting, called The Surrender of Barcelona, in which he celebrates the surrender of that city to General Franco's army. One feels that the assessment of the literary, the assessment of the artistic merits of the two paintings has rather given way to the question of which side were they painted to support, which is the more important question. He didn't think, although, as I say, he was a man of proudly British descent, the Canadian nationality, he didn't think much of post-war England. His last novel, written towards the end of his life in 1952, and rejoiced in the title of Rotting Hill, the capital of a dying empire, his impressions of post-war London. If that is what he thought of London in 1952, what do you think of the open sewer that now passes for our capital city? It's probably more moderate than Roy Campbell, who was another person who took the nationalist side in the Civil War. And just to give you some, in Spain, some idea of how things have changed, I'll read you a little from Campbell's foreword to his long poem, The Flowering Rifle. Campbell, incidentally, had gone to Spain on, with his wife, and what had really radicalised him was witnessing a massacre of the Catholic clergy of Toledo by various communist militias, when you were forbidden to remove the bodies of the dead from the street, as according to others, and someone had painted the slogan, "Thus strikes the checker," on the wall above, against which all these unfortunate priests had been shot. He took to the national side very strongly, but he also took against its intellectual fellow travellers in England more than he did against the Reds in Spain, who at least had the courage of their principles and fought for the cause in which they believed. And this is what he wrote. But what is more interesting than the fact that he wrote it is that Methuen published this. Now I would like to consider how many mainstream publishers would in the year 2014 publish this foreword, which was published in 1939, how much less free we are now than we were 75 years ago. Humanitarianism invariably sides where there is most room for sentimental self-indulgence in the filth or famine of others. It sides automatically with the dog against the man, the Jew against the Christian, the black against the white, the servant against the master, the criminal against the judge. It's a form of moral perversion due to over-domestication, Protestantism gone bad. Just in case he hadn't offended left-wing readers enough, the foreword ends with the words "Viva Franco, arriba España," which was not going to go down too well. Mind you, one could tell a tale against Campbell and say that this is a man, it shows how we all become the thing we hate. A man who began his political engagement being shocked by a communist massacre of Catholic clergy, and ended it by writing poems celebrating the execution of prisoners from the International Brigade by the Legion of Black Ships, which might not be thought to be so very different from the very things that shocked him in the first instance. He is someone who has effectively disappeared from literary memory, if you like. He complained about this a great deal because he was no admirer of Nazi Germany. On the contrary, fought the British Army in the Second World War. And wrote afterwards, it makes no difference that one fought as willingly against fascism as one had done against Bolshevism previously. Even if you killed 10 times as many fascists as you had previously killed Bolsheviks in self-defense, you still remained a fascist. Well, having read the foreword to The Flowering Rifle, I have to say, I am surprised that he was not welcomed back with open arms into literary London. The last, of course, and I think I'm beginning to run out of time. I'll be told by Louis.
Only on the camera.
Only on the camera. Well, the last who has been reinvented in an almost Orwellian fashion, which involves ditching by far the greater part of his literary work, because so much of the political message is embarrassing, is Henry Williamson, who's now remembered only for his book Tarka the Otter, a charming short story. Henry Williamson was in fact so extreme, he probably shocked some of the people in this room. Although he was extremely strange kind of way, he had been South London and made the mistake of joining the army out of a sense of adventure in 1914, when he certainly got plenty of adventure. Again, he surprisingly survived. He fought the Battle of Mons and in many engagements after that, so he was all 4 years of the First World War on the Western Front. Your chances of surviving that as an infantry officer, which is what he was, were not great, but somewhat surprisingly he did. He then became that most curious combination of things, a fascist and a pacifist, as well, of course, as a proto-Green, and completed a monumental 15-volume work, The Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, which I did read 25 years ago, and some might say it took quite a large part of 25 years to get through it, although it is a gripping piece of writing, so long as you take it slowly and pace yourself. I don't recommend trying to read from the point of view of the post-war political order. He only completed it in 1969, so he wasn't daunted by the fact that he was writing books that a lot of people didn't like. It has been more or less sent down the memory hole. You can actually find copies in most public libraries if you look hard enough. The man is remembered only as the author of Tarka the Otter. It's a truly Orwellian oeuvre to try and get rid of the larger part of a famous author's writings, because it's so off message, but preserve the parts which are less offensive. It's interesting that he had a historical antecedent in that respect. William Henry Hudson, who was another example from an earlier era, the Victorian era, of someone who combined a lively interest in what we would now call green politics. He's perhaps the first person to write on environmentalist issues for the popular market, and achieved enormous success in the late 19th century for doing that. But had a long history. He was curious, although English descent, he'd been born in Argentina, where his father had emigrated. He'd been born in a little town of Quilmes on the Pampas, about 40 or 50 miles southwest of Buenos Aires. But his father had achieved a remarkable feat for someone not born in the country, and becoming one of the inner circle of the dictator Rosas, the most interesting proto-fascistic figure who, believe me, the young Brazilians who were attending Mises institutes would not have liked at all, because first of all he wasn't into liberty, and secondly his opinions on Brazil were not worth repeating. Then Hudson became quite an apologist for Rosas, and in all his works you see this depiction of the dictator and his proto-corporatist, proto-fascist state, which endured for about 19 years. Always depicted in the most favourable light, with the dictator as a heroic figure. This was essentially a discourse that he learned from his father, although he himself met Rosas as a young man. So there is quite a connection, a very interesting connection, between environmentalism and politics of a sort that are well outside the pale of the system, and indeed literary achievement. Now, that is all in England. Far more of such a tradition, of course, succeeded in France and is better known. If I had the time, I would talk to you more about it, but I don't think I'm going to attempt to, because there may be a possibility you actually want to ask some questions. And if I were to start on the subject of connections between literature and non-conformist rightist politics in 19th and 20th century France, I could probably speak for the whole of the afternoon and bore you all rigid, particularly those who are not too interested in our nearest continental neighbour. And rather than overrun my time limit and overstay my welcome, what I think I'm going to do is to call it a day a little bit early and take any questions that people may have for the remainder of my time slot. Thank you very much for listening.